Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. Before we begin, I just had a question. I'm very curious about this. How many of you consider yourself comic book fans? Woohoo! Few. And I was curious, how many of you are here with academic interests? Oh my God. That's wonderful. Well, no pressure. Yeah, no pressure at all. We certainly hope to make this entertaining, and we're going to cover a lot of bases in a very short period of time. So to begin, a really basic question, one I'm actually interested in and I've not asked you yet. How did this book happen?
It's a good question to start with. First of all, this crowd is insane. I'm so thrilled. Thank you all for coming out. This is so much fun. And I'm so honored to be in dialogue with Phil.
I'm thrilled. You have no idea.
So this book kind of has a lot of histories, and one of them is, of course, kind of my own history as a young teenager living in suburban Orange County, California, coming out of the closet at a really young age, and encountering the X-Men the first time in its 35th anniversary issue. And I recently wrote in a blog post for Avidly that this was, to me, this issue, this cover, was like a gay boy's dream. It's like a holographic, shining pink tower of disco-attired superheroes. And I mean, my fantasy would have been to be like lifted up by a big muscle hunk, like surrounded by powerful women. I just think that would have been, it was just amazing. But I think that that was a transformative moment in my life, because I think, like many people probably in this audience and everywhere around the world, as a kind of alienated, disaffected kind of teenager experiencing homophobia and bullying, I encountered the X-Men and I felt immediate identification. I had never seen a form of popular culture where I felt such intense identification, but with characters who were nothing like me, and that was so odd to me. And so it was years later, when I was studying at UC Berkeley, doing cultural studies, popular culture studies, that one of my great mentors, Kathleen Moran, who is one of the people I dedicate the book to, she just said, she's like, why aren't you studying comics? And I was like, I don't know, I just love comics. And she said, you're gaining all these intellectual tools, why don't you start asking questions? And so I started asking myself the question of, was I the only person, this seems naive now, was I the only person who identified this way with the X-Men? Or did other people? And so I was fortunate to be asked by this professor to give a lecture on comics and consumerism, and I felt like no story could be more about consumption than the Dark Phoenix saga, which many of you might know, in which, a psychotic member of the X-Men, who I love, I don't say that negatively, gains enough power to consume an entire star, and I was fascinated by like what kind of imagination would create this. And I think what I realized as I delved deeper into this was that this was not only was I not the only person who experienced this identification, the ability to identify with the X-Men in this way was because of a massive cultural project that people who wrote and drew and read comics from the 60s onward took up as a project. And that mind-boggled me. Like, how was it that an entire generation of creative, luminaries thought, like, let's remake comics to speak to these kinds of people? And that's kind of those are kind of the origins of the book.
Two quick things.
Yeah.
One, I didn't realize until yesterday that we were both from Orange County. I went to high school in Orange County, which I thought was kind of stunning. So in terms of that sense of alienation and difference, I get it 1,000%. A weird and random question. You said that you were reading the X-Men and they were nothing like you. Do you mean that they didn't look like you, or that you could not find yourself in any of those characters?
Oh no, I found myself in so many of them, but little pieces of myself. So it's like I didn't look at a character and say like, oh, they're like, Storm, a Kenyan immigrant mutant. It's just like me, like a gay suburban Lebanese American boy. I thought, I identified with her value system, with her sense of commitment to, mutant community and kinship, and coming from a queer family, basically like all of us are gay in my family. I really, that's what I identified with, and I love the fact that it was never symmetrical. I never looked at an X-Men character and thought like, that's exactly me. I thought like, oh, this person has like a little shard of me in them, and that's so fascinating, and I felt like deep identification without similitude, without symmetry, and that's what I loved about the comic book.
We have talked about that a little bit before. before, and I find as a creator in comics, there's a real frustration because people more and more demand to see themselves very specifically in and out, projected on the heroes that we draw on the page. They no longer want or seem to want, and I'm talking in large swaths, shards of themselves. They want to see themselves, and if they can't, then they claim they cannot relate to the material any further. It's frustrating. Oh, I tell this anecdote, I just think you'll appreciate it. Gay boy in Orange County. That the interesting thing to me about the X-Men was always they were positioned as outsiders, as queered, as people who are hated and rejected by society. But to my mind, they were this team of fabulous looking people who dressed up in disco clothes and lived in a mansion in upstate New York and like went to outer space a lot. And I just kept thinking, if that's what it means to be different and hated, I'm like, sign me up, right? Like I was all about that. I would, because I am not an academic, I have actually written just a few notes here that I'd like to cover. So forgive me while I read aloud. Graham Marcus described your unsatisfiable critical fervor and your generosity of spirit while describing the book. And I said, I wanted to bring these things up because I certainly noticed them while reading your book. It reeks of joy and enthusiasm, and there's a fervor for the material that you're critiquing. It is so readable. It's just an absolute pleasure. And I gleaned so much information that's currently transforming the work I'm doing right now, and I wanted to say thank you. Further, I just want to say for those of you with a lack of formal education, in a sort of academic education like me, like I'm just a working journey person in this business, it is remarkably accessible. So I really do hope that you enjoy it, both, again, for its academic analysis and just its fanish love. It's really beautiful. So, I had one other practical question for you. How did you do physically research for this project? There are hundreds and thousands of comic books out in the world, and I'm really, really curious how you literally sat down and started reading.
Can I actually respond to the first thing?
Sure.
First? And then I just want to say something because I know that there's a lot of people who do scholarship in this room, but then also people who don't, but who are interested in it. I think a lot of what drove me to write the book the way that I did, with that kind of, it means so much to me to hear that, especially from somebody who's in the industry, because as somebody kind of who grew up in a cultural studies education, I really learned well how to identify, racism, sexism, homophobia, like all of the horrific shit that, excuse my language, that comes out of popular culture. And yet all of us who were doing that work loved popular culture. And I couldn't quite understand what it meant to both to critique popular culture, but then not to address the side of it that you loved so much. And so I really wanted to tell a story about comics that captured the exuberance and the pleasure that I got out of them and that so many people that I knew got out of them. And so, I'm sure many people in this room who teach or work with a young generation of students, my students tend to be so well trained in identifying how evil everything is. And yet I want to look at them and say, like, do you have fun? Like, do you enjoy the world? Like, in the face of all of these horrific things, like, do you find pleasure? And they find so much pleasure, and they don't know how to describe it or how to talk about it, because they think that critique means criticism, as opposed to like lovingly engaging with something in a sustained way. And that's what I wanted to do in this book. I wanted to show a loving, sustained engagement. And a good example of this is, I don't know how many people have had a chance to take a look at the book, but I spend a lot of time, I'm obsessed with the Fantastic Four. I write quite a bit about them. And I write a lot about race in the Fantastic Four, which is a very deeply complex, bizarre problem in the comic book. And I do a reading of a very, very complicated scene where they encounter the first African superhero, the Black Panther, who's from a fictional nation, Wakanda. And the first time they encounter him, it really reeks of a kind of negative anthropological imaginary, like, who are these weird African people? And I read the scene up, like in the opposite. I say, this is amazing that a mainstream comic book written by white Jewish Americans is saying there is an African nation in the 1960s that is politically and economically independent, that is ruled by a brilliant, educated, democratic leader, even though he's a king, he's egalitarian. This was so amazing to me. And I had so many academics who just wanted to say it's racist, it's evil. And I said, you know what? James Baldwin in that same moment historically was saying one of the most important driving forces of the civil rights movement is that African Americans can see a liberated Africa. And I thought this is kind of an amazing thing, and we often ignore some of the extraordinary work that popular culture is doing when we feel that we need to make it fit our ideological worldview, as opposed to like allowing it to live in the world and see what it does. So that's kind of a long-winded answer just to that point.
No, it's actually a fabulous answer, but it leads to two other questions that I had for you, which is actually about the way you analyze material.
Yeah.
And you were just talking about white Jewish Americans and processing and creating this sort of material, and yet you generally avoided talking about the people who created the material. You're interested in critiquing the material itself. And I was just curious if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. So something that we've talked about a lot, and I've talked about with many people, is I downplay biography in this book intensely. I'm not completely disinterested in the biographies of creators, but I also think at the end of the day that people produce things, they themselves are a product of their society. And then those things circulate in the world, and they have meaning, and we attach meaning to them that far exceed what creators are interested in. I think the comic book industry, this is my own perception, this is my own opinion, tends to place an incredibly powerful weight on the biographies of creators, partly because creators in comics have been so ill compensated for their work creatively. And I really am sympathetic with that fact. But I also think that desire to control the meaning of a text, to say like, oh, this comic book means X because the creator did this, leads you to this. First of all, that's not how people actually read. Imagine 99% of everything you read, from comics, the movies you watch, you know nothing about the people who created them. And that does not diminish your ability to make sense of it at all. In fact, because you don't know about the people who created it, you can have an endlessly open-minded kind of approach to those things. And so you see in my book, I engage quite a bit the work of a dear friend of mine, a brilliant scholar named Nirvana Tanuki, who thinks a lot about scale, about what it means that whenever you encounter a literary or a cultural text, you have to scale conceptual distances. Like she says, you know, somebody in Senegal can read Jane Austen, and they don't need to know anything about British history, and they don't need to know anything about the history of the novel, and they can still make sense of this book. And this is what I think is amazing about comics. You can pick up any comic book from any historical moment, see the craziest visual imagination. You can see the X-Men, you know, travel to a distant planet to fight like an overlord around like a pink crystal. I'll show the image in a little bit. And you're like, I get it. I'm down with that. Right? And so I'm really interested in what it means for people to be able to scale those distances. What kind of visual and narrative tools do comics offer you to be able to make that leap? And I think when you reduce everything to what the author meant, then you can't actually access that. So just one last example I'll give is people, if you know a lot about the comic book industry, you know that it is now deeply motivated by the demand to sell comics. So if we wanted to, we could say every single thing that happens in a comic book is simply because people want to make money. End of story, call it a day. And I think that would be a very limited understanding of how comics work, because most people who read comics know nothing about the economic workings of the industry. And they still make meaning out of those comics. So I wanted to address that part of the equation.
As just someone who works in the industry, one of the things that is fascinating to me, if I can address two things. One is I'm astounded by fans of the medium, fans who are voracious consumers, longtime consumers, who really don't seem to have a semblance of understanding about the economics of production, or where and how they think where they've gleaned that information it tends to be an internet gossip site, may or may not actually have any sort of basis in reality. But I'm always stunned to, particularly when I'm on Facebook or in any sort of internet forum, how confused I am by the way consumers think comics are made and the sort of finances that go into their production. Secondly, the other thing that's really interesting, going back to meaning, I just know this from doing this for 25 years, that there are many, many well-intended people who create these comics, and often they bring an enormous amount of thought and care, or at least they attempt to their final work. But invariably, it's certainly happened to me over and over, all of that is shunted aside to say meet a deadline, or because crossover is coming and suddenly my story doesn't matter and now I have to insert another character for 3 issues. And what's interesting is you were talking about is that consumers may or may not know that, but they certainly attach meaning to the final product. And so I know that no matter what story I'm telling, I'm thinking about that, right? So that whatever material I'm putting on the page, whatever art, whatever writing, somebody is going to find meaning in this. And so I know I'm very, very careful. I try to be very careful considering the constraints of the medium with what I put out there. One thing I was really curious about was you love the Fantastic Four, you love the X-Men. Obsessed with the Fantastic Four. The Fantastic Four stuff is amazing, which we'll get to in a minute. But you, in your book, you talked about Marvel creators being about leftists, and you write a lot about Marvel characters, just a little bit about DC characters. Why is that?
This is a great question. I've been told a lot, my book is kind of like unequally weighted towards Marvel, and I think that that's just like a fact. I think a lot of this has to do with the fact that I think Marvel and DC had different conceptual histories. I think that DC Comics was deeply attached to a very classical vision of the superhero as an idealized American citizen. And you get this in the kind of the classic 3 of Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman. People often ask me if I write a lot about them in the book, and I have complicated reasons why I don't. Not the least of which is that they are the most written about characters in academic scholarship. But I think that when DC came up against the counterculture in the 60s and after, they really struggled about how to redefine their characters, how to compete with Marvel and not lose the spirit of kind of classic Americanism that had defined their characters. I think some of the most fun work of the DC in this era that really needs to be written about is the crazy kind of bonkers stuff that happens with Superman in the 60s and 70s. This kind of like, they start to compete with Marvel by making the world crazy. They just create like Bizarro Superman and like a miniature universe in a glass jar and, like Crypto the dog, and like that stuff is really fascinating to me. But I think in many ways, the book argues that DC inaugurated a transformation that then Marvel took up, and they inaugurated it in the Justice League. But I think what ended up happening, part of what we do as scholars is we have to choose what examples we think are most potent and most exciting. Many of the things that I argue are happening in Marvel in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, they are actually happening at DC, but I found that the comics in which they were happening were not as rich or as complex or as interesting as the ones that were at Marvel. So I actually just made intellectual and creative decisions about where to place my weight. So one example that I talked to you about yesterday, I had written a little bit about the Legion of Superheroes, which I think are amazing, and I wanted to dedicate like a whole chapter to them. And many of my advisors when I was developing this project were like, no, drop that chapter, right? And so it ended up weighting in another direction.
So going to the Fantastic Four for a moment, right? So one of the things I love about that chapter, there was a description of the thing. I like the queering.
I'll show you.
Yes.
The Thing is a sissy.
The Thing is a sissy.
This is mind-boggling, by the way. We'll come back to this in a second.
But the sort of the critique and analysis of that team, particularly contextualized against late 50s, 60s communism, Cold War politics, etc., and the notion of hyper-masculinity, 50s masculinity, was fascinating to me. And so I'm curious, as you read that material, was this stuff that became glaringly obvious to you, or how much did you bring to that work?
It's a great question. How many people have heard of Unstable Molecules? This is a brilliant graphic novel. I'm actually writing about it right now for an article. So in many ways, the Fantastic Four is the core of my book. It is like where everything started for me. And part of it was that I had never read them. I had always read tons of Marvel comics. I'd never read Fantastic Four. And I stumbled upon Unstable Molecules, this amazing graphic novel that is about what it would have been like had the Fantastic Four been ordinary people living in a suburb in Long Island and had never become superheroes. And their lives are horrific. Like, their lives are boring, white, middle class. They are alienated. And it follows one day in the life of all four of them. And I was shocked that every time I turned a page, sexuality was like at the forefront. So Johnny Storm, who would have been the Human Torch, is constantly called gay bait, and like there are all of these, and sissy, and etc., because he loves comic books and that's associated with homosexuality. He's approached by a beatnik who's like a Jack Kerouac character, who calls him a holy flaming flower. Like, there are all of these moments, and I kept reading it, and this is true of all four of the characters. There's so much discussion of their sexuality. And I just thought, like, did James Sturm, who wrote this, like, did he attach this to the comic book? Or is this something that came out of the original series? And so I went back and I started reading the series, and it was like everywhere in the original series. Like, I was shocked by the number of references to these characters' sexualities and genders, and the fact that their mutations radically altered their gender and sexual kind of makeup. But instead of this being a crisis, like in almost every, many of us know this, like in almost every form of American popular culture, film, literature, television, gender and sexual deviancy was always horrific and needed to be recuperated. And this comic was like, isn't it awesome? What a mess these four are. Like, you would see an image like this, and instead of being like, oh, that's so horrible that he's a sissy, you'd be like, that's rad. Like, I love this character, right? There's a moment in the comic book where he gets sent a Beatles wig, and the Beatles were, of course, kind of famously androgynous in their early years. Somebody's like, oh, he's going to be so offended, and he puts it on, he's like, I love it so much. And it's like, you can't tell if he's a man or a woman. And, what I loved about these characters was that they embodied some of the central logics of 1950s gender. So the hard masculinity, right? But they were soft inside. They were effeminate, and they questioned their own desires. So I think it's amazing that recently Matt Fraction invented this character called Miss Thing, who's a woman who dresses in thing drag. But like, the only way that you could do this is if the history of the character had allowed for it. That we all know as readers that he is really a softie inside. So the fact that a woman can dress up in his outfit reveals something about him we already know. I'm just going to leave that. Right? So, I mean, I often talk about this amazing image where they look like the Jetsons, like meets Leave It to Beaver. But, right, like, they look like the perfect family, but one of them looks like a paperweight, like is a literal rock. One of them is on fire, like the flaming homosexual of the 50s. But they're flying into the 60s, and instead of that being a disaster, it's a beautiful, amazing thing. And so I'll just conclude this answer by saying that what really thrilled me about this comic book is that it was a form of American popular culture that said to Americans, listen, if you want to enter the space age, if you really want to go out into the universe and meet people, you're going to have to drop all of your attachments to being normal, to being gender normative, to being heterosexual, because the universe is a crazy ass place filled with amazing, weird people, and you need to be ready for it. And so the Fantastic Four modeled what it looked like to be open to a universe of people who are not like you. And I thought that was just amazing, and that's why I spend so much time with them.
As I say, that analysis was fantastic. As a Fantastic Four fan who came in later,
yeah, this hilarious. Is like the kind of the fan club stuff, and I think it's amazing again that like they use the Thing, the most alienated weirdo in the Marvel universe. He looks at fans and he's like, "You belong with me." Right? Like, Marvel Comics sold this idea or this vision that like you belong if you don't fit in. I think it's really amazing.
It is amazing, actually. And it feels like so much part of Marvel's ethos, actually.
100%.
It's the DNA of that company. speaking of weirdos, I was hoping.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, no. There we go.
Fantastic Four. They
Tell me more.
talk about many weirdos. It's okay.
That's what I wanted to get to. So speaking of weirdos, the X-Men.
Yeah.
So you told me yesterday that you actually got to the X-Men after sort of its, excuse me. You got to the X-Men after Chris Claremont and Dave Cockrum and Len Wein sort of revitalized and internationalized the team much later. So what was it like going back to read that original material? What was that
from the
experience
70s?
like? Yeah.
How many of you have read the X-Men from the 70s? It's mind-boggling. It is such a feat of creative world making. It is visually so exuberant. It's so pleasurable to read. It is a psychedelic kind of, I mean, I'll talk about this in a second, these images of different women characters exercising their mutant powers. It was so expansive in its vision. It's like you couldn't have just a couple international characters. Every character had to come from a completely different country. They had to have the most elaborate personal histories. The comic book did really serious, difficult work around identity. And I think that this made so much sense in the 70s, kind of because by 1974, when the comic book gets revitalized, we're seeing the major social movements of this period, Black Power, civil rights, the women's and gay liberation movement, third world movements, they have now become popularized. They're past their heyday, and by the mid-70s, the counterculture has circulated into mass culture. And so what's amazing is that the comic book says, like, okay, let's take up the challenge of these movements. Let's talk about what it means to be different in the world and to have to negotiate and deal with that difference. So one of the things I talk about in the book is that what I think is really amazing about this comic book is that its narrative is all about race. It's all about racial and international difference, but its visual politics is all about gender and sex. So like its visual politics borrows from disco, from kind of gay and feminist disco culture. Storm constantly references figures like Diana Ross. So you see this exuberant explosion of feminine energies. And I think this is one of my favorite, I talk quite about. Right, I mean, a disco ball, I do a very long kind of interpretation of this image in the book, where the X-Men on the left, they encounter this alien army called the Shi'ar Guard.
Yeah, the Imperial Guard.
Yes, and what happens is that we actually can't distinguish any of these people. So people who are supposed to be different than you actually look like you, but you're all different from each other. So the comic book actually dealt with the fact that like each one of these characters makes up an individual universe of their own, with their own stories, but what happens when they all collide? And that's why I love, like, there's one character in the middle who screams aliens. Right, but like the word references every single person in the image. So there really is nobody who necessarily belongs. So I was fascinated by this visual culture. I thought it was so daring for its moment. It does extraordinary things, and I think it's extremely feminist. And I found that just totally beautiful. And that's why I wanted to write about it.
We talked about this a little bit yesterday. One of the reasons I think you should go back and read the Legion of Superheroes is, of course, because the Imperial Guard is sort of homage to that team and designed by the same artist.
Totally.
With a similar, obviously, aesthetic, and I would suggest social sensibilities.
Absolutely.
So I think you would actually appreciate it. This led into this story actually was all about, in many ways, Jean Grey.
Yes.
In your book, you talk about two female characters.
Yeah.
I was just going to reference this. Storm and Jean Grey.
Yeah.
And one of the things that was really interesting to me, who would you like to talk about first?
Oh, I mean, I talk about Storm a lot. I talk about Storm a lot, as we all do. So I can talk a little bit about Jean Grey. I think Jean Grey is, again, Chris Claremont does extraordinary things with her, because she is in many ways, I was talking with my dear friend Tony D'Agostino about this. We often look back at the history of the X-Men and we say that the central tension of that comic book is between two different competing visions of mutant futurity, between Magneto, who believes that, mutants have to fight even to the death for their survival, and Xavier, who believes in, peacekeeping, etc. But, I went back recently and I reread the first issue of the X-Men, and I actually think another way of interpreting the book is that the tension is between Xavier's idea of discipline, of rigorous training, and the radical radical disruption of discipline that Jean Grey represents. She is the first woman to enter the team. And as soon as she enters, all of the boys on this team lose their minds. Except Iceman, which, I mean, this is a whole nother story. It's kind of like, whatever, I don't like girls. And now, like, 45 years later, they've made use of that. But she represents a kind of chaotic energy that enters the team and never goes away. It transforms the entire history of the comic book. And so I think that what Claremont did in the 70s is that, and in a way how could you ignore the women's movement in the 70s? You could not reintroduce a kind of plain Jane, boring white woman character if she wasn't in some way colliding with the women's movement. So you have this woman who gets transformed into one of the most powerful cosmic beings in the universe, and she is struggling to kind of deal with the fact that she is at some level a very ordinary, everyday person who has now been granted a power so exceptional, so extraordinary that she doesn't necessarily know what to do with it. And so, you know, I do a lot of work with this image. At the end of this famous storyline, the Phoenix Saga, Jean Grey becomes tasked with reknitting the fabric of the universe, and who does she turn to help her but a black woman? Like, I just think it's an amazing moment in 1978 in which, you know, a white woman and a black woman, like, bind hands to save the universe. And this is like the moment when the women's movement is fracturing around the issue of race. And, you know, who knows if anyone knew that, like, among comic book circles, but this is the moment that the Combahee River Collective, you know, one of the most important black lesbian feminist collectives, was releasing their statement in which they were talking about the need for what we now call intersectional analysis, for thinking about race, class, gender, sexuality, etc. simultaneously. And I often argue that this is, you know, this is the X-Men's feminist statement, is this moment. And I really wanted to kind of do justice. I remember taking this image to one of my advisors and saying, am I overreading this moment? She was like, girl, this is what's happening, like, on the page. Like, you nailed that. Like, this is literally what's happening on the page. So I think that there is something deeply moving about that.
It's actually interesting, two things, particularly pertaining to Jean Grey and feminist movement, because I have argued creatively for a very long time as a person who killed Jean Grey the last time.
That's true.
That was me.
That's deep.
Is that the interesting thing about Jean Grey to me as a character, drawing that character during Grant Morrison's run on X-Men, was how she'd outgrown that team, she'd outgrown that space, and the constant need, nostalgic driven, I believe, the demand for familiarity to bring her back and rein her in to that world, I think did immense damage to that character. That character, through this story, through other stories, became bigger than that. And it's interesting that need to rein her in. And I found her quite tedious, actually, because I was just like, why is she here? She has become more than this. But and it made me think actually about the end of the original end of the Dark Phoenix saga, where she lived. But of course, there was this sense from the editor-in-chief at the time that she had to be punished for her actions, for becoming this thing. And what's interesting, we didn't talk about it here, but there's a facet of Jean that really, particularly when she becomes Phoenix, which I find really interesting, mostly of course because it was explored by men, but still really interesting to me, is this notion she becomes a hypersexual being as well.
This dominatrix.
But particularly in her guise as a black queen. But again, it's punished for that, like repeatedly. And I don't know where I was going with that, except for just thinking about Jean Grey. I have found her a really fascinating, frustrating character historically, again, because once she had this story, once she became this thing, so many years of time and energy, so many authors were all about putting her back. Get her back.
It's funny you said, we talked about this yesterday. If you read past some of the issues that I talk about in the X-Men, there's the X-Men at some point go to this place called the Savage Land, which many of us might know about. This kind of Arctic refuge, where dinosaurs still exist. And there's an amazing moment when the X-Men think that Jean Grey has died, and Storm is devastated that her best friend has died, and she goes to Cyclops, the team leader who was Jean Grey's, love, and she says, I just want you to know that I'm mourning with you. Like, I miss her too. And he says, I don't really have any feelings about her because she became a completely different person than the girl that I met. And it is this shocking moment where Claremont writes this panel where Storm looks at him and she's like furious, and she says, if that's how you feel, then it's because you wanted to, this is the line, you wanted to preserve her like a fly in amber, and what you didn't realize was that she was no longer a girl and she'd become a woman. Like, what an amazing, like, what? Like, what? Like, that is such an extraordinary moment in which the comic book itself is admitting that she had outgrown a certain kind of white liberal feminist, I am woman, hear me roar, that by the end of the 70s, of course, many feminists began to find really problematic and really limiting. And I think the comic book admitted that, and I think it's interesting that later creators could not actually deal with the fact that the Claremont run had already addressed this complexity.
Just as a quick behind the scenes thing, I remember, again, doing that X-Men book about 10 years ago and suggesting to the then editor that Jean was better as a cosmic character. Like, to put her with Galactus, Silver Surfer, that milieu, and they were like, no, they were not interested in exploring her in that way at all. And that her primary value, it seemed at the time, was as a foil for Emma Frost. It was as a romantic foil.
That's so interesting.
That was her value as a character at the time.
Oh, that's fascinating.
So just a little behind the scenes there for you.
Did you want to?
I did. I'm so excited.
By the way, we're going to do Q&A too, but we have to talk about the New Mutants.
Okay, so it's not only the title of your book. And I brought this because I actually used to have my comics bound by the DC Comics library. One of my favorite prized possessions is the New Mutants, bound in black leather. So the title of this book and your analysis of the New Mutants was so important to me on reasons both personal, scholarly. I can't even tell you. It's my all. So I would love for you to talk about the New Mutants.
How many people have read the New Mutants? It's my favorite comic book of all time.
How many of you have read the New Mutants from issue 1? Okay.
It is thankfully reprinted now. Worth finding in any form that you can. The New Mutants actually came as a shock to me. It was not a comic book that I had read when I started the project. I originally ended the project with a chapter on what I call stories of demonic possession in the 80s. And I do a long kind of extended comparison between the Dark Phoenix saga and the Venom saga and Spider-Man. And I just didn't feel that this was the right end to the book, because I felt that other things were happening in the 80s that were really interesting, and in many ways, anybody who knows anything about comics in the 80s also knows that in the popular imagination, the entire period has been collapsed into 2 comic books, which are The Watchmen and The Dark Knight Returns, which are comics that I have very negative feelings towards, and was told by readers of my book originally that I should cut 2 pages of, I wrote a devastating takedown of those comics, and they were like, tone it down. It's fine, don't worry about it. So I came upon the New Mutants by accident, and in many ways it's because I told you I couldn't get a hold of the Brood saga, this well-known Claremont story, but I found the issues of the New Mutants in which the Brood saga kind of crosses with the New Mutants. Started reading this comic book, and one of the reasons I read it was because a lot of people who were reading my work were saying, you never deal with indigeneity, you never deal with the question of Native Americans and Native American identity. And in the original X-Men of the 70s, there's a Native American character who dies in the first 3 issues. What are you going to do? And I said, that's a really good question. I have to think it through. So I started reading the New Mutants, and I was mind-boggled. This comic book reapproaches this idea of mutation that by the 80s had become so well worn, so common in superhero comic books, you could not imagine that it could be reinvented. And what really blew my mind about the New Mutants is, I argue in the book, it is the first comic book in the history of superhero comic books that says, what if people with powers did not have any sense of an ethical mission to save the world? What if they didn't know what the purpose of their powers were? What if they had to actually invent a reason to use their powers in any given way? And rather than this being cynical or negative or an abandonment of politics, it was actually the most political thing you could ever do to say, people have to figure out what they want out of the world. People have to figure out whether or not they want to do good in the world. So these mutants, unlike the X-Men, who were like bound by mutant identity, they meet each other and they're like, I hate you, I hate being a mutant, this sucks, I don't know why this is happening to me, my life is ruined. And they face a series of threats to their identity, to their kind, where they have to be like, okay, wait a minute, I might feel one way, but I actually have to negotiate with you, like how we're going to respond to these things in the world. So what was really shocking, and if you end up reading this chapter, is that I found that the most useful way to analyze this comic book was to turn to feminist political theory. To people who are arguing about what feminist political action looks like, where political action in the absence of absolutes, where you don't come together saying, we already believe X, Y, and Z, and let's do this. You say, we don't know what we believe, let's negotiate it together. And this is what the comic book was. It was an extended meditation on what it looks like for young people in the 1980s to come together and figure their politics out. And one of the ways that the comic book does that, and we talked about this, is that it makes so many of the villains in the series are like actual embodiments of historical traumas and catastrophes. So like the Demon Bear, arguably one of the most famous villains in the history of the comic book, is an actual like embodiment of the trauma of Native American and Indigenous genocide. And so what does it mean for teenagers to have to like look genocide in the face, in the form of a figure, of a fantasy figure, and say, like, what are we going to do? What are we going to do about this? Like, this thing is going to murder us, right? And like, we actually have to respond. And so this is part of what drew me so much to the comic book, and it felt like such a more genuine, authentic way to end the story that the book was telling. Of course, the epilogue is actually very depressing. It's about the death of Captain America and about genocide and all that business. But I mean, that's a long answer to like part of what I love about this, and I think that it dealt with indigeneity in such a brilliant way, because the comic book thinks about indigeneity as the experience of dispossession, which is not an identity. It's a lived experience that actually spreads out across so many identities. And so the comic book really thinks through, what does it mean to be dispossessed of one's identity, to feel that your identity is co-opted by capitalism, by history, by trauma, and like, what does it mean to reclaim a sense of self in the face of that?
One of the, just quickly, one of the things that you pointed out in your book, which never occurred to me, was Karma. And her, Karma was, about 19, from Vietnam. She was a caretaker of her two brothers, or brother and sister, and basically had to choose, do I go to this ritzy school, or do I keep a job to take care of my siblings because our parents are dead? And the sort of economic weight of that choice, right? It never even occurred to me, and really until I read your analysis of that, how potent that was, and how sophisticated. Where and the thing that we talked about yesterday a little bit was, and you pointed out in your book, I think really beautifully, is that the New Mutants, each of them, comes from places where their differences are not only sort of genetic but economic, right? The fact that Sam and Roberto, two completely different economic strata, they come together. And that, it was so obvious in the text. I was rereading the text today. It's so clear. But somehow having that pointed out in the book and sort of and really examined and explored made me rethink that material and how sophisticated it was.
It's so class conscious. I mean, if you read the X-Men today, it always makes me furious. Like, we're going through the worst recession of the last 20 years, a housing crisis, and they're like billionaires. Like, there's no There's no sense of class consciousness like being addressed, and the comic book is so class conscious. So is, of course, things like the Dark Phoenix saga, which actually addresses the uneven economic situation of the city of New York in the early 80s. And I think that talk about intersectional, I mean, that's part of what lends the comic book its richness, is that it addresses that issue.
And especially through the lens of young people.
Yeah.
Like through the eyes of young people who, and this is a silly thing to say, it's really funny. The one thing that's interesting to me about reading older comics now is that I tend to forget that they were young, the authors, the creators themselves were young when they created them. There's something about knowing them now. Part of being in the field is that I know so many of them as peers, and yet I think, oh my God, the work that you wrote that changed my life fundamentally, you wrote when you were 22, 25, when you were as young as the characters you were writing about. And to me that, again, that just, the very idea blows my mind because I forget it so easily.
Totally.
Should we ask questions?
Yeah.
Does anyone have any questions?
Thank you both so much. Like, I could listen to you both for
I'm sorry, we're talking so fast.
days. No, this is fantastic,
no.
and it's about comics, so I'm dying.
Yeah.
So I actually wanted to return to Jean Grey and think about. I mean, it's really interesting to think about her being a foil for Emma Frost, and also like being like her position as like just the love interest between Wolverine and whatever. But what I also was thinking about her iterations as not only as Dark Phoenix and Phoenix, but all the clones that came from her, or all the like. So, what is it about? And Jean Grey's never had a solo comic, right?
No, I don't think so.
No, someone get on that. I know Storm just had her solo comic. So, what is it about? Do you think Jean Grey that she's so popular, she's so important, but yet they can't let her? It's like she returns in these weird forms, but never as, I don't know. I'm not sure exactly the question I'm trying to ask, but it's this way that her popularity keeps her coming, but like her story is sort of I don't know, dull. Except we were talking about in Extraordinary X-Men.
It's all about young Jean Grey is now really
and also in the all-female
character.
X-Men, she's interesting too.
Yeah, this is a great question, and I think it's like hard for me to answer. But there's a way in which also it's like she is about the obsession with white womanhood, and it's being corrupted. So we keep having to return to the question of like what happens when white womanhood is corrupted over and over and over and over again, and we can't really like come to terms with that. And I think Storm sidesteps a lot of those questions. She's like this very organic figure who produces really complicated, like in a way, she is not required to like heterosexually reproduce the family and all of this stuff. And Jean Grey was supposed to be the woman who like, the middle class white woman you get married to and have kids with and settle down with, and she kept failing at doing that thing. And she keeps being reinvented, like as Madeline Pryor, as like the person who might, the next version of her might do this, right? And then that never happens. What I find really distressing, and we talk about this a lot, it's something I can talk about if somebody wants to ask about it, is kind of the contemporary visual violence in comics is really, it's a boring thing to say, like I'm disturbed by violence in popular culture, but like I have certain reasons for that. Now, she disturbs people so much that every time she comes back, she has to be murdered so violently. She has to be like stabbed to death by Wolverine, like 1,000. I couldn't believe those pages were approved, like in Phoenix Rising. Like we're seeing a woman get stabbed to death over and over and over again in like 3 pages. She has become such a conceptual problem for the Marvel Universe because she is like the white woman who will not be contained, right? And I just think that and I think the reason for that is because whenever you bring her back, as a writer, you're like, she has so much power, I need to do things with her. I can't let her be ordinary. And then there's the need to like rein it in. So I don't know if that's like a good answer to your question. But
I have 2 quick thoughts about that too, and they're creative. One is the notion of reining in, like part of Marvel's sales pitch, its sales tool, is that this is the universe outside your window, which is incredibly problematic to me as a creator, because my personal belief is that the socio-political landscape of the planet would be vastly different if these characters truly existed. But they can't or won't imagine a world that extraordinary or that transformed because they believe it would limit reader relatability. So I think that's one thing. You can't explore Jean because she has to in some way configure to a norm because of the fear that people won't relate to her and therefore will not consume the comics, right? So that's one. The second thing is, and this is industry stuff, and this may or may not be fair, but the industry now, and I include myself in this pool, are a group of people who are weaned on comics and have nostalgic feelings towards particular images and ideas of certain characters. I'm certainly guilty of that. And so part of that is it depends on the creator who gets a hold of that character, because invariably they are less interested in exploring where that character is now and putting them back into the place that they remember and that makes them feel good.
Yeah. Yeah, Tony, we'll do like a loop.
I'm really interested in your initiating argument about the superhero as a sort of plastic or about like a malleable figure.
Yeah.
And I'm really interested in your argument. And I'm also interested in your argument about the way that the New Mutants especially negotiate culture.
Yeah.
But I want to sort of see those two things connected in the way that, what do you think about the way that the New Mutants especially negotiate different types of embodiment?
Yeah.
Like, so for instance, like Ileana is like the innocent little girl who turns metal.
Yeah.
There's Warlock and Rain who are shapeshifters, and then Karma, who introduced in a Fantastic Four comic book, like your two, the two things, right? She's the only X-Man ever who has a weight problem, right?
Yeah.
She gets possessed by an evil character,
Yes.
and she has to deal with this new type of embodiment that says so much about capitalism and so much about the pressures of being this hyper determined body, like superhero body. What would sort of be your read of that in terms of like give a Fantastic Four read for the New Mutants?
Yeah, no, I think that my version of that for the New Mutants, let me just back up and say, part of what I wanted to do with this book is I wanted to do two things. I wanted to talk about the cosmopolitan and radical imaginary of comic books. I wanted to show that comic books have trained American readers, or at least did for at least 3 decades, in imagining their political relationships to others otherwise, and reinvented what it meant to produce kinship, community, etc. One of the things, the other thing I wanted to do was to introduce a series of concepts for not only thinking about comics, superhero comics, but about fantasy as like a political tool, about like how do we use fantasy, like magic and teleportation, etc., to actually deal with real world problems. And so one of the concepts I introduced is this idea that I call flexibility. The idea that superheroes presented us not with bodies that were flexible, but with bodies that were constantly in flux, like moving between different identities, different forms. And when you're constantly in flux, like life is really complicated. And it means that you have to develop all of these kind of responses to being in flux. And so what I would say about the New Mutants, like the quick version, is that I think the New Mutants was a comic book that used the shifting bodily forms of its characters to map how history leaves a mark on people's bodies. Like, it is a comic book that's about when you enter the world and you're young and you begin to realize that you're part of a long past, you're part of a Native American culture and you're part of the history of Vietnam and kind of American intervention in Vietnam, your body starts to register that these things have happened. So Ileana is a fascinating character because, as you said, she's this innocent, Russian, pure white girl who then ends up spending 7 years in a demonic realm. And in order to escape, she has to absorb a certain amount of that evil. So she becomes this contingent character who's not innocent. And she bears the scars of that on her body. And a good example of this, we talked about this image yesterday, kind of in the famous storyline, the Demon Bear Saga, when the various New Mutants have to fight this demonic apparition that represents Native American genocide. There's a moment when one of the characters, talk about a horrible form of embodiment, she gets almost eviscerated by the bear. And she's in a hospital room and they're fighting the bear in another realm, and the bear rips through time and space to try and get at her. And I find this, talk about a moment of fantasy, where fantasy is saying, by the way, history is real. Like, history is not immaterial. It actually gets inside you, and it can hurt you. And so you actually have to face history and deal with it. And so that's what I think is happening in that's like my quick read, is that I think that the different transformations is about kind of registering history on the body.
This is far less academic, but one of the things that interests me about the New Mutants particularly, and a few of the super teams introduced in the 70s and 80s, we talked about this, whatever the visual and social politics of their appearances, they're incredibly interesting and fun to draw because they are so radically different from each other. One of the things that stuns me, particularly about the New Mutants, rereading them today, is how each character was so visually and physically distinct. There was no mistaking one character for the other, and that their physicality was so much a part of their character, right? Like how they navigated the world, how they navigated with each other. There's this fantastic picture of Rain Wolfsbane, who's like 4'10", right? And Cannonball is 6'3", and just seeing the difference in their scale of height completely informs the way I read their relationship, and I understand when he is chiding her, for example, for attacking Ileana for her demonic life. And he's basically saying, I reread that passage about, he's basically saying, listen, we're all going through it. Like, let's do this together. But what's amazing is how their physicality absolutely informs that conversation.
Totally.
It's such beautiful design.
Should we, and then again, we'll keep going. I'll try to answer questions a little quicker so we can get a bunch. Yeah.
Hi. So you mentioned early on that you don't engage with sort of the biographies of the creators who created these comments, but I just want to know what you thought about that, about how these characters were created mostly by white men. But
I really am invested in the belief that people can actually step out of their identity and be creative, and so there's a weird way in which I sidestep that question. I always go back. I love this brilliant scholar who's a dear friend of many of ours, Jennifer Nash, who's written an amazing book called The Black Body in Ecstasy, Reading Race, Reading Pornography, and an amazing moment when I watched her give a job talk at George Washington University in which she was hired. She writes about interracial pornography in the 1970s and its relationship to radical black feminist thought. And she did this whole beautiful reading, like interpretation of this pornographic film, and then somebody in the audience said to her, like, do you think that this would have been whatever, less racist or whatnot if it had been done by a black, director? And she said, we're all steeped in the same racial myths. Like, we're all living in the same society. She said, certainly, had the director been African American, they would have had a point of view, but it doesn't mean that it would have been exceptionally less racist, because we're all steeped, that's what she said, in the same racial fictions. And I thought that was such an amazing answer to me. And so I'm less interested in the identities of the creators, because if you get caught up in that with comics, then just give up, just don't write about the medium. It becomes a thing that is an impossible hurdle to get over. What I was interested in, and you see this throughout the book, is the fact that these creators, regardless if they came from similar demographics, kept encountering an audience that was so diverse that kept telling them, do this, try this, why don't you try this? And so I was interested in how the actual texts were the product of a negotiation between a semi-homogenous group of creators. Of course, they themselves may say, we're not the same, don't say that about us, right? And a vastly diverse range of readers and cultural critics. That's what interested me, that moment of collision. That's what I was fascinated by.
So not to talk about biography, but just to talk about, I think I read a lot of these comics as being belated, as sort of coming late to the thing, that whatever that thing might be. So for example, Sam Wilson, who's the Falcon, who he sort of comes into Captain America in the early 1970s, and he is this noble social worker from Harlem, right? Which is a trope from literally 1963, that by 1972 the Black Panthers are already sort of tearing that apart, right? But of course, course, these, the creators are sort of coming late to it.
Yeah.
Right? And the same thing with, you were talking about Black Panther. Black Panther's actually about Ethiopia, right? And if you think about the fact that both Kirby and Stan Lee were World War II veterans, Ethiopia is in the popular imagination as the one African country that is not invaded.
Yes.
Right? But of course, it's 20 years late, right?
Yes.
And so it's like,
Yes.
but the change in comics is that these things, become closer and closer and closer together, to the point where now Captain America is like talking about like Fox News. Right? And so,
totally.
And so this issue of belatedness shrinks and shrinks and shrinks the closer you get to the present.
Yes.
Right? And so, I mean, I just finished the book, and it's wonderful, and I think that you don't address it directly, but this is actually what you're describing as well.
Yeah. Well, let me say, I think part of what I do in the book is that I want to argue that sometimes comic books are late to the game because they are registering something that has been happening in like radical politics or in other elements of our culture, like as they've unfolded. And one of my arguments is that comics didn't merely reflect what was happening. They began to respond at the moment that those politics reached an impasse. Right. Like, I think that like the reason that they get to like this question of race late in the 60s is because it's like in the late 60s, that's when the new left suddenly like can't deal with, the entry of women and like black women in the movement, etc. And I think that comics were trying to innovate beyond the impasses. And I think that's kind of part of what was happening. I don't know if that, why don't we take like 3 or 4 at one time and then, like I could just we can hear them and then we can like respond to like 3 of them. Is that okay? I've done this many times and it works really well.
I trust you.
Yes, and yes. Those 3. Do you guys just want to tell us your questions and then we
shout
can
them out?
Yeah.
At the same time.
You want to start?
You start.
This is kind of maybe related to Jonathan's question.
Yeah.
Thinking about when the subtext becomes text, and thinking about the most recent FF series that we had missing on there, and the wizard shows up with his new variation of the Fright Before, and he literally says something like, "Your weird queer family can't face my heteronormative.
Oh my God.
Can't deal with my heteronormative."
Somebody read Judith Butler, like was somebody that fraction read one chapter.
Right, but I'm just wondering if you can respond to that.
Okay.
To that the subtext, things that you see in French in the Kirby era, suddenly becoming to the surface.
Totally.
Okay, yeah. So, X-Men, there's obviously a big theme of like genocide and the world's gonna end and everyone's gonna kill us.
That's very recent, by the way. I don't think that's always been the central vision of the comic
book. That's what I was gonna ask. I feel like it's become the default of this just kind of grimness, especially lately they got sterilized. So I wanted to ask you why that's become an obsessive thing, and maybe why it works sometimes.
We've just talked about this.
We've had epic conversations.
Say about this.
And his epilogue covers it beautifully.
Thank you.
Beautifully.
Yeah.
My question is also about modern comics, and particularly in regards to individual identity. So,
there it is.
Genocide.
Would have said that these X-Men comics from the 70s were in any way subtle, but the distinction I kind of make is that if your mom or dad had picked up that comic, they might not have really gotten what it was about, so to speak. But if the parent picks up like Batgirl today, it's like, here's a bunch of hipsters and they have all these interesting sexualities or whatever. It's like very explicit what's going on there, and that seems to be a shift to me. I was wondering if you had any thoughts about that.
So I think, let me answer the first, because I think those are linked. Again, this is my own as like a cultural historian. I actually think the comics from the 60s and 70s were very obvious. References to the Beatles, references to Kennedy. It doesn't seem obvious to us today. The writers from Stan Lee, all of these people, they were steeped in the popular culture of their moment. And so in many ways, the Fantastic Four is fascinating to me because it's all on the surface. There's no subtext. Like everything is right there in your face. And so I think what you're seeing with the increasing referentiality of these comics is like the increasing releasing niche marketing to particular readerships, so that like the intense corporatization of the industry makes it so that like that there's like a hipster demographic that will respond to using the word heteronormative. But like people have really bristled at me saying that like I don't think anyone needed a character to come out of the closet in the 70s because they already knew the X-Men were queer. Because the visual culture of the comic book was letting you know that. Yeah. Now, I think there's great value in identifying a character, in saying like this person is gay. But it has to be, to my mind, situated within a larger universe of complex engagement. If you just are like, oh, this person's gay now, like what is that? That has no meaning outside of like actual social engagement. So I think that that's what you're seeing in those moments, is a kind of savviness. But you know what? The version of heteronormative in the 1960s was like, inferiority complex. That gets said in the Fantastic Four. Psychoanalysis was the great intellectual craze of the 50s and 60s, and readers recognize that language. So in a way, it's not that radically different. It just seems embarrassing to us now, right?
I just actually want to tack on this. I feel like is actually exactly what we're talking about: corporatization, like aggressive corporatization of comics, particularly niche marketing, and what I was talking about earlier, which is that desperate demand to see oneself literally represented in these characters. The metaphor of the characters is no longer enough. Yeah. It must be me. It must be my group. It must be named. It must. It's no longer symbolic. It must be literal. And I've always been, particularly with the notion of mutancy or otherwise inhumanity, the Inhumans, I'm always really fascinated about how many layers of metaphor you can tack onto the metaphor. Like, so black, gay, queer, Catholic, and a mutant, right? Like, how much of that needs to be literalized? I'm personally, I don't really know, because I also believe that there is incredible value in seeing oneself in a comic, in a form that has traditionally not always been so great about visual representation. But it always, that need always blows my mind.
Yeah. I want to respond to the genocide question real quick and then take a couple more. I'm horrified by this transformation in American comics, in which we've seen since the mid-1990s, and I've often said that if I write like a sequel to this book, I want to talk about genocide narratives and like apocalypse, because comic books have become, and I talk about this in the epilogue, so much about crisis, about constant, endless crisis. And what has happened is that the X-Men series, to my mind, has essentially been reduced to survival, to bare minimum survival against one threat after another, after another, after another. So you don't see the kind of creative world making that you saw in the 70s, because like these characters that don't have time to talk to each other. Like I often make the joke that like when you were reading the Claremont run in the 70s, like 3 issues would go by and like people just were talking. They were engaged. Like that's what democratic politics is about. It's like you actually have to get to know other human beings who are not like you. And in the X-Men now, it's constant desire to survive, bare minimum survival. And we see a level of visual violence that is so horrific. We now actually witness the physical destruction of the bodies of characters we love. Like, you don't just see Wolverine heal, you see him get like shot in the head, with like a bullet that explodes his brain. Like, it's so unreal to me that we now are okay, like, I have like, this is what the X-Men looks like now. Right? Like images of bodily obliteration. These are horrible, like trigger warning moment. What horrifies me about these scenes is that we now are introduced to a visual imaginary that tells us that characters we have fantasized about as a way to change our world can be mutilated, destroyed. We now have this in our head, and we can never get it out. Like the idea that a character as majestic as Storm, that something like this could happen to her is so horrific to me. And so, in a weird way, some people will argue that this is realism, but I actually think it's deeply nihilistic, because the point of fantasy is not to reflect to us, like, this is what's happening to real people in the world, and it's not informing us that violence is happening to people in the world. It's getting us to be entertained by the obliteration of characters that we've fallen in love with. And so my reading of it is, this is a very ungenerous interpretation, is that I think that the turn to genocide narratives is about a sense of such deep political bankruptcy in the possibility of changing our world. Like, comics no longer have radical movements, except potentially now Black Lives Matters, to actually respond to. Like, these comics were in relationship to the women's movement, ACT UP. Now there is nothing like that, that they can be in conversation with. So they're creating their own vision, and that vision is unbelievably dark. And I often say, there was an amazing moment around 2005 when Marvel Comics had just organically, out of its own creative world making, reached a point where there were so many mutants in the universe of Marvel that they now constituted like their own population. And I was so excited. I was like, I remember that moment in 2005, and I was so excited. I was like, I wonder what the world will look like now. And they were like, we don't know how to deal with this, and they obliterated all of them. They were like, let's just kill all of them. So I have said to people, and this shocks them, what does it mean that comic book companies that are now representing us back at ourselves more often kill us all? Like, actually make us spend money on watching ourselves be murdered, and we are entertained by this. Like, this is a sign of such political bankruptcy, and that we have to imagine otherwise. Like, fantasy has to give us I was with my mom watching Star Wars, and she loves dramas, and I just was like, let's just go watch this. And we're watching the previews, and every science fiction movie is like so devastatingly horrible. The world is gonna end, we're all gonna die, we will get a disease. And I thought, like, you know what, Star Trek, the adventure in Star Trek was like, you went out into space and like you met people. Like, that was cool. Like, you met people who are not like you, and you were like, you're weird. Like, and then sometimes there was conflict and you had to negotiate it. Why is the pleasure in this? Like, I don't understand. People keep telling me that, like, reading X-Men is like watching a Michael Bay movie, which is actually kind of true now. So that's a long-winded answer. But I think it requires a completely new political imagination to fight that trend.
Just a little anecdote, just because I think it's interesting. I remember talking to a high-up editor at DC Comics about teen characters, and he said the only way teen heroes can learn to be heroes is to know death. Just to let you know who I work with every day.
That's so intense. And by the way, if this was actually about again, right, like, there's an argument that's made about, like, well, it's documenting real life violence, whatever. If this was really about, like, some of you have heard me say this, and I wrote this in a post, for the post that I mentioned for Avidly, like, the X-Men moved to San Francisco in 2008 for like 5 years, which I loved the idea. I was like, this is so fascinating. They were there for 5 years. They never met gay people. They never met anyone with HIV. It's like the epicenter of HIV outside of New York, San Francisco. They never dealt with the housing crisis. They're just like buying islands off of the headlands, right? And I thought, it's not that the comic book needed to be realistic, like document what's happening in San Francisco. It's like, I'm wondering what would have emerged had the fantasy characters met people who are complicated, and like, what would that have looked like if you had actually dealt? And I believe that if comics really want to be realist, like want to show us the world, that's what they should show us. Is like those complicated negotiations, right? Should we take a little group? Are we okay? I know we've probably gone over time, but are people okay?
Got time for one or two more.
Okay. Maybe we'll like take a little grouping of them. You two, and then Alex, you wanted to ask something and take these last three? Okay.
Hi.
I want to hear you talk a little bit about your method and how archives seem really necessary to this. You have like a lot of letters pages. Because as we all know in reprinting, letters get dropped out. So all the readership and histories of readership are gone. So I want to hear you sort of talk about this, especially at a moment when there are new archives being created. Here at Columbia, Chris Claremont's papers have been really formative. So I'd like to hear how that sort of informs your scholarship and what you think about comic scholarship going forward.
And I just want to say that Maggie here is one of the people who's writing the most amazing work on comics archives and using them. So if you also want to learn about this, you should talk to her.
I also would actually like to point out Chris Claremont, who's here, the author of much of the work that we've been discussing this evening.
My head is exploding.
Yes, mine is too. But he's, everyone should know he's here.
I got all these from Columbia's archive.
I'll talk about that actually because your archive changed my whole life actually. It's amazing. Back there, and then Alex. And
But you were talking about like.
I'll. Okay. I just want to like grasp them all, and then we can.
Okay. So you had talked about how Grant Morrison had reined Jean Grey in.
No, Marvel. I didn't. Not specifically Grant.
Okay. Well, I might say that under his run, certainly. But then I was thinking about what he did for Crazy Jane during Doom Patrol, which is really interesting because he sort of liberates her, and he liberates her through Steele, who's been emasculated in the classical sense and in like the American manhood sense, and what your thoughts were on that, because it is such a stark difference, but obviously X-Men and Doom Patrol.
Really. And then lastly, Alex.
Well, I have a question actually for both of you. So I just finished reading the book, and we're gonna have a chance to talk about it.
I'm gonna be in dialogue with Alex on Saturday.
And I had a sort of similar. I had a question for you about this, about writing about comics as a visual medium. And I feel like so much of what people who do write about comics, and I just wrote a thing for Artform about my interest in X-Men. It was focused so much on narrative and the discussion of the actual contributions made by the visual side of the work, which is really how we experience it. I mean, you showed these amazing Bill Sienkiewicz images of New Mutants, and New Mutants is not the same thing. As much as Chris Claremont is the most amazing comic writer of all time, yes, we love you, Chris. But like, New Mutants with Sienkiewicz is a whole different storytelling, right? So I wonder if there's a way we can kind of talk about how we talk about the contributions made by the visual artist and how important they are to the storytelling and to our identifications with these characters and to the representation, particularly in terms of gender and race, right? And where places that it can go so terribly wrong in terms of representation in comics, and also can go so right, as the case of the New Mutants, where under certain artists they were not hypersexualized, they were very individuated and not with stereotypical but with believable differences that are phenotypically based. So I guess I'm just kind of asking how we talk about the contributions made by the visual artist in this, and it was something that I felt like you really talked about specifically in reference to Green Lantern, Green Arrow, and Neil Adams. You seem to really be able to address his interest in a kind of realism. But I wonder if that's something that, I'm just wondering how you approach that.
And I think I can tie that to method. Method is such a good question. This was an extremely challenging project on a number of levels. You mentioned one, the sheer volume of comics. Like the number of comics you would be shocked that I haven't read is amazing, and but then you would be amazed at how much I have read. It's an exceptionally voluminous medium. But I will start by saying that the biggest methodological challenge from the start of the project was separate out that people did not take comics seriously, right, in a variety of fields, but also that comics had been written about from a very limited number of angles. So people either studied comic book form, they treated it totally as an aesthetic or artistic product without caring about the content, or they became obsessed with content to the slight of form, or they were like they were insiders about comics who believed that based on biographies, etc., they like knew what they were saying about comics. That was it. So the struggle that I had is I wanted to both take comics seriously from a very interdisciplinary standpoint, meaning I wanted to look at them from multiple angles, historically, culturally, aesthetically, and to weave those all together in order to tell this like totally different story about what comics were doing. So at some level, this required just like a very expansive view of comics. When I first started the project, I was just reading tons of comics. And I was lucky, I won this visual studies fellowship. And it was Vanessa Schwartz, an art historian at USC, who pulled me aside and she was like, listen, if you read a book where you tell people at the end that you sat in your bedroom and you read a bunch of comics and then you wrote this book, you will never get a job. Like, this is going to be a whoops. And she was like, you need to reinvent where you are seeking out your sources. So I thought, okay, let me rethink this. I started going to all of these different archives. I started doing all this research about like where are comics held in this country, like old comics. Where are fanzines held? So I went and I lived in Lansing, Michigan at Michigan State University for 1 whole month in the summer. They have the largest comics archive in the country. They have thousands of fan material, letters pages, all of these amazing things. So I started to think of comics that I was reading as one node in like a network of relationships. And I started following the lines. And I realized that so many people who write about comics don't follow the line. They pick one node and they're like, I'm in that. And they think that the entire interpretation of a comic book can be gleaned from that one node. And I thought, no, like I have to put it in this network. So letters pages are one. If you've looked at the book, I talk a lot about fan letters pages, and the reason they're fascinating is because even though they were curated, like creators got hundreds or thousands of letters and they only picked a few to publish, they are the most widely circulated form of fan writing because they would appear in every issue and they would circulate to hundreds of thousands of people. What amazed me was that people who write about fans don't write about letters pages. They write about fanzines and conventions and etc. And I was interested in why letters pages were being ignored when they were so rich. And one of the readers of my book kept pushing at me. They kept saying, well, like, you can't prove that any real person wrote these letters. You can. It just takes a certain kind of work. But I didn't care. Like, even if creators invented every one of those letters, like, but why then would Marvel choose to publish letters that were about feminism and about, anti-racism? Like, let's say they fabricated all of them. It means that Marvel wanted to sell that vision to people, and that's fascinating to me. So that was kind of one of the things I did. I had to get creative. I mean, I would go on eBay. I would buy an entire lot of comics. Like, I bought the entire New Mutants on eBay. So I would do all of these creative ways to amass an archive. And my method was ultimately about reading for scale. So I talked about this earlier. I would look at a comic book. I would situate it in this vast historical, social, cultural context. And then I would look at its political world and I would say, how did this comic book allow readers to leap from this page and this panel to like this political imagination? How could you look at Storm and think like third world politics? Like, what was the thing that allowed you to do that? And that was kind of my method of analysis. That's what I started analyzing for. So that's kind of a few. I don't know if that feels substantive enough. I struggled a lot with the visual because this could have been a book where all I did was talk about aesthetics. So like when I write about the Spider-Man's Venom saga, it's very difficult. Like, I had long sections where I would analyze, who's the name, the very famous artist of that? Todd McFarlane, who popularized a very, I would say, kind of gross. I mean, I think it's like this hyper masculine, intense, the vision we have of comics now. I was talking about Venom as a hyper masculine figure. I mean, I say that he's like a leather daddy, right? Like, but what happened is that when I would produce these long pages of analysis of the visual imagery, I would get lost in writing about the artist. So like I had like 4 pages on Bill Sienkiewicz's form, where like I talk about his line drawing and how like the way that he scratches on a page is like the scratch of history. It got so deep that my readers were like, your actual reading of the page is enough. Like, we actually get it. So what I did is I would very methodically choose when I wanted to pull out certain techniques that I thought were important. So you mentioned Green Arrow, Green Lantern. I analyzed a technique I call the psychic overlay, which is where the artist would draw a silhouette of the hero, and it would be like the hero is like lost in thought, and inside the silhouette is like an image of urban decay, and they're like thinking about like the blight of urban, culture. And so instead of going into a long thing about what is Neil Adams' artistry like, what is his style like, I just read what was on the page. I just interpreted what he was drawing. So that was a choice that I made. I think these artists deserve, like Bill Sienkiewicz deserves like a book, like on his style, but I would have gotten lost. I had to ultimately remember that I was doing like a cultural and political study of comics and their visual imagination, and that it couldn't be about the individual artistry of every artist. And that was hard for me to abandon. I have to admit that I have not read Doom Patrol, so I have a limited answer to that.
And my only answer to that would be, if you ask Grant, he might have a completely different take on his run on the X-Men at the time, his experience with Marvel. I just remember drawing that book several times over and being in the editorial offices at Marvel at the time and having these discussions, which just sort of blew me away in how limited they were in their vision for a particular character. I remember suggesting, what about this? What about this? What if you put her here? No, she belongs here, she belongs here, she belongs here. I was just awed by the pushback. I haven't admittedly read Doom Patrol in 15 years. I remember loving Crazy Jane, but I remember loving Crazy Jane not for any particular socio-political reason, but because I love split personality as a thing. Like, I'm fascinated by that. So I can't honestly answer. My guess, though, is if you were to ever reach out to Grant, he might have a completely different memory or take of what was happening in Marvel at the time, and particularly his take on Jean. I just also remember that drawing her death, it was actually scripted very differently than the plot that I received, and I was quite disappointed in her final end because it was very, very different than the plot. And so when I actually read the dialogue, I was like, oh, that's not what I drew at all. But okay, here you go. That's comics, right? Like, but again, that was my personal experience at Marvel in the editorial offices, talking to the X-Men editors at the time about the possibility of expanding Jean's role in the Marvel Universe and getting enormous pushback from the men who were in charge at the time.
Well, and can I just say, it's interesting, you were saying that you felt that Grant Morrison's vision of Jean Grey was kind of limited. I had very mixed feelings about Grant Morrison's run on the X-Men, even though I actually quite love it, partly because I had been reading The Authority years before, and it felt like he was transforming the X-Men into The Authority, which was a comic book I loved, but it made sense at, like, what is it, Wildstorm or Image, right? But it didn't quite, the style didn't quite make sense to me. What I love about Grant Morrison, though, what he did with Jean Grey, is he built on Claremont's mythos of the Phoenix. Like, we learned that the Phoenix is part of a lineage of like thousands of different beings in the universe who have been selected by this cosmic force. We learned that like when she dies, she goes to this place where like she recharges until she belongs back in the world. I found that stuff so interesting and fascinating, and not a single writer ever since that happened took advantage of what he did with that. Like the white hot room and all of these, like, I think that he added complicated ideas to the cosmicness of her that were generous. They were about, like, the Phoenix is about millions of people in the universe, not just about this one woman. And I'm a little bit thrown that nobody ever kind of played on that. It just disappeared from continuity. Like,
that happens with a lot of Grant stuff, though.
Yeah. So, I mean, I would love to take Q&A forever, but we've been here for a while.
If you want to step back, we'll have some books for you to sign. People can ask questions.
Thank you guys so much. This was
Thank
really
you.
fun.
Thank both of you. That was tremendous.